So today we have Robert Sutton here with us from Berry Law, and he's going to talk to you all about letters of recommendation. Um, I'll go ahead and let him take it away. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and thank you for introducing me. So, as mentioned, my name is Robert Sutton. I generally go by Bobby. So, if at any point in time you're emailing me, you're calling me, or we're discussing anything during this particular presentation, Bobby or Robert is fine. If you're more comfortable being more formal, have at it. You won't offend me, but I want you to know that you should feel as comfortable as possible. So, today we're going to be speaking about law school letters of recommendation. And I guess before I get into that, let me preface with a little bit of my background. Um, Probably far older than most of you. I'll be 39 this year. But I did come to Berry School of Law. I am an alumnus. I graduated in December of 2015 and started practicing law right around February of 2016. After about 8 years, my wife, who I met at law school, and I had two beautiful daughters. So I've kind of taken a step out of practice and gone back to the law school to work in an administrative capacity. But the long and the short of it is I've gone through the steps that you are potentially considering going through in the very near future. I'm more than happy to share what I'd like to believe is my wisdom on the topic. Certainly, I won't say that I'm the be all end all authority, but having walked that path before, I hope that my experience can shed a little bit of light for you. So real quick, because I want this to be as interactive as possible, it looks like we've got about 9 people in the chat right now. If you could just put in the chat where you're at in undergraduate and, kind of your 1 to 10 scale of how likely it is you're going to be applying to law school in general. All right, awesome. So legal studies undergrad, we're already considering law school. All right, while you guys are going through that, feel free to continue to type in the chat. I'll move us along a little bit here, and let me see. I may have actually covered the screen that I need to. Bear with me. All right, great. Did we move slides there? Am I on the still the correct screen share? It should be the agenda.
Yes, you're on the agenda.
Okay, awesome. I just wanted to make sure everything was working appropriately. All right, so the agenda for today. First is going to be the big question, and I'll tip my hat a little bit. The big question is going to be, what is the question that law school review committees are asking themselves when they're looking at a law school applicant's application? And it's important that you have an understanding of this because ultimately, everything that you put into your application, whether it's a letter of recommendation, whether it's your personal statement, how you construct your resume, etc., it should all basically move you forward in answering this response or responding in the positive for this particular question. And I'll open it up to some guesses as to what that question may be before we get to the next slide. But I also want to talk about some of the basics of applying to law school, what the process looks like, who it goes through, what you'll need. And then we'll talk more specifically about letters of recommendation. Who should you be asking? How should you be asking them? And then what guidance should you be giving them in drafting the letter of recommendation? And all this is going to tie back into the big question. So very quickly, just in the chat, or if you want to unmute and give me a response, please feel free. But if I were to ask you, what what is a law school review committee looking at, or what question are they trying, what singular question are they trying to answer when they're looking at an application? What do you think that would be? Why you're going into the practice of law? That is absolutely a part of it, but I will say it is a piece of the puzzle that adds to kind of the larger question. So do we have any other guesses out there, or anyone willing to venture a response? And I will say, if you are considering law school or intending to go to law school, now's a great time to start getting some practice and hearing the sound of your own voice or putting your own thoughts out there. That is how a large part of the learning will happen during a law school class. So please don't hesitate. There are no wrong answers. Um, If an answer isn't exactly there, we'll guide it back to where it needs to be. All right, so it looks like other than Anthony, no one quite comfortable enough to venture a guess yet. So let's put it out there. When a law school review committee is looking at an application, they're asking themselves, has this particular applicant who's before me demonstrated an ability to be successful or succeed in law school and thereafter? It's a very pointed, easy to understand question. Every aspect of your law school application outside of biographical data should go towards answering this question in a positive manner. So let's talk a little bit about the basics. I don't know if we have any seniors here yet, but has anybody truly explored applying to law school or maybe even applied to law school already? All right, awesome, Anthony. You have applied, so you're going to be pretty familiar with this process. Um, Hopefully, some of the information that we share today will be beneficial to you because there's always the opportunity to amend. If you don't mind me asking, I'm assuming you're a senior if you have applied. All right, Dylan's saying not yet. Dylan, how close are we? Is it still something we're just considering, or is it we know we're applying to law school, we just haven't gotten to the point where we're doing it yet? Next fall. Okay, so it is pretty much a certain thing. We're just waiting for the right time. Awesome, Anthony. That's wonderful that you've already got decisions back. Hopefully they were favorable. And if not, maybe today we'll shed some light on how we can increase those odds going into the future. All right, so let's start with the idea that in terms of Berry Law and most other law schools within the United States, we are American Bar Association or ABA accredited. For those law schools, your entire application process will essentially go through LSAC or the Law School Admission Council, what you'll commonly hear referred to as LSAC. This is going to include your CAS or your Credential Assembly Service Report, which will include those letters of recommendation that we'll be discussing here today, as well as the specific law school application itself. So a lot of times what will happen is you will essentially build your CAS report and then you will fill out individual law school applications and LSAC will transmit those to the appropriate law schools for review. One thing to understand about your letters of recommendation, specifically for law school and going through LSAC. I know at least for me in undergrad, when I was reaching out for letters of recommendation, guidance counselors, teachers, employers, etc., would often be like, all right, well, draft something up. I'll review it. I'll make some edits. I'll make sure that everything you're saying is true. I'll sign it and I'll ship it off. With your law school letters of recommendation, that'll be a little bit different. You will actually submit a form to the recommender requesting it to be sent directly to LSAC. For the most part, you generally won't have an opportunity to review the letter of recommendation itself. And you may end up never actually seeing it. So what that really means is when we're deciding who to ask, how to ask them, and what guidance to give them before they draft that letter, it's vitally important because that's our opportunity to make sure that the letter of recommendation itself is adding as much to our law school application and providing as much evidence as possible to answer that big question. Has this person demonstrated they're going to be successful in law school in the positive? I will say this, law schools in general will have varying restrictions or requirements for their letters of recommendation. Generally speaking, the sweet spot is going to be 2 to 3 letters of recommendation, a page to 2 pages in length. Unless the school says otherwise, it doesn't mean if someone has a lot to say, they can't write 3 pages, or if you really feel as though adding an additional letter of recommendation, bumping it up to 4 will increase the likelihood of a successful opinion in regard to your application, that you shouldn't do it. but also just verify the school's requirements to make sure that you're not under or overdoing anything. Obviously, attention to detail is one of the things that a committee is going to be looking for in answering that big question. And we want to make sure that we're not, exercising a lack of attention to detail in the admissions process itself. Certainly, that is something that you may not consider, but it is something that review committees will pick up on. Any questions so far about applying, what's required to apply, or just kind of the basics of applying to law school? All right. I don't think I see any questions, but we can always circle back if that is the case. All right. So let's talk a little bit about who you should be requesting your letters of recommendation from. And I apologize, I'm going to keep going back to the big question. And in the sense of who, it's going to be a question of who can speak to the qualities that a law student must possess to be successful during law school and thereafter. And generally speaking, your two big categories are going to be professors or academic letters of recommendation, or supervisors or professional letters of recommendation. Now, obviously, there is some wiggle room outside of that. Certainly, your individual circumstances may dictate that you have someone who's able to kind of speak to the qualities that we're looking for in a law student. But I think these two are really the overarching themes or overarching groups that are going to be the most beneficial in speaking to whether or not you have the drive, the capability, the skills, the knowledge, et cetera, to be successful in law school. So why are professors or academic letters of recommendation important? Well, if the committee is asking themselves, can this person be successful in law school? The short version is that, can this person be successful in school? So consider the classes that you've connected with the most. Oftentimes, if it's a subject matter we're greatly interested in, we're going to be very active participants in class. We're going to look to lead group discussions. We're probably going to spend a little bit more time on that writing assignment compared to a class that we don't really have a real interest in. So identify professors of classes that you really took a liking to, that you feel as though you excelled in. And what are we really looking at? Well, did you participate heavily in class? A lot of the learning that occurs during law school is through cold calling or the Socratic method. So, as part of your preparation, you'll do reading that will kind of prepare you on the underlying theories or principles that you should be considering when looking at new facts. Once you're in class, you will briefly review the case law that came from, where the facts are set. But most of the learning, most of the ingraining of that knowledge occurs when the professor starts looking for volunteers or otherwise cold calling on individuals to say, all right, well, how would you apply that theory, or how would you apply your knowledge if this fact was different or all the facts were different? So if there is a class where you were heavily engaged in discussion, that is a huge green flag to our review committee that, hey, this individual is prepared to come into law school and make the most meaningful time, or make the most meaning out of the time they spend in class. So another aspect is, how did you do well, or how did you do on assignments, specifically written assignments? A huge part of the law is being a good persuasive writer. Being a persuasive writer means making sure your facts are correct, making sure that your authority is correct, but also being concise and having an ability to trim the fat, so to speak. I can tell you, as someone who has practiced law, what judges tend to find the most annoying is when they get a page of facts that are completely irrelevant to the motion or the response that you're submitting. It often puts them in a bad mood and will otherwise shade their further review of whatever document you submitted. And then also, the practice of law in and of itself is collaborative, and individuals that are successful in law school will also have a strong support network. And what does that mean? Well, that likely means that you work well in a group setting. So again, were you a leader of class discussions? How did you perform on group projects? Were you a leader? Were you someone that was delegating, or were you someone that was delegated to? And not that there's inherently anything wrong in either aspect of it, but it's more about what is your ability to delegate? What is your ability to take direction? And if they're able to speak to that positively, again, that is something that the law school review committees are going to be looking at. So let's talk kind of about the second half of the question, right? It's can this person be successful in law school, but also do we believe that they're going to be successful attorneys or successful professionals that are using their Juris Doctorate degree? And that's where supervisors can come in. Generally speaking, obviously, if there is a one-to-one experience, you've been a paralegal, a legal assistant, a law clerk, or one of the other many, many terms that they'll use to describe support staff in a law office. That's a wonderful opportunity to kind of show that, yes, I have the ability to exceed in the practice of law because I've been doing so for X amount of time. And individuals who have been your supervisors, who have assigned you work, who have reviewed your work, who may have at times relied on your work, are an excellent resource to kind of discuss that. Um, what were we looking for when you were communicating with them or clients? Was it prompt and professional? Was your grammar good? Was your spelling good? Did you timely get that response out, or was someone waiting for a week in the dark, which isn't a good thing? Have you used any similar skill sets in your current position or a past position? Were you having to do research, especially legal research? Were you having to critically read documents? Were you having to analyze documents? Were you having to offer opinions on the way forward or strategy as to something the business itself is doing? Client communication is always important. And this isn't just in the sense of legal clients, right? Maybe you were a hairdresser, maybe you were a server. Anything in the service industry where you're interacting with the public, you're asking probing questions, and ultimately you are tailoring the service that you provide to their expectations, again, is something that can help support your position that, hey, I'm going to be successful in law school, I'm going to be successful thereafter. And then obviously any ownership of major projects. I see it all the time. Letters of recommendation will come in and this individual came in as a summer intern. However, they quickly grasped the concepts that were thrown at them. And before we knew it, they were handling the new marketing campaign or they were handling the new data input campaign and, ultimately increase the efficiency of our business. So that's kind of who to ask. Now, also important to law school is a dedication to service or a willingness to help your local community, because ultimately that is what we do with our law degrees, with our legal licenses. You act in a very supportive role, both as a source of knowledge and expertise, but also as a counselor, right? Often people aren't going to their attorney because everything in life is going great. I always tell people that before we were referred to as attorneys, it was often referred to as a counselor. And part of that is not only are you there to counsel them on the legal aspects of their case and provide that expertise based on your knowledge, your study, and your training, but you're also helping them to kind of see their case more objectively. Clients are often the most invested in their own cases, and there's a huge emotional part of that. And unfortunately, emotions in the law don't always coincide. Um, so if you're able to show a similar skill set through the recommendation of another, that is absolutely something that is going to be to your benefit, and weigh in your favor for sure. All right, so you've done a little bit of thinking, and just out of curiosity, is anyone in the audience, having thought about that for a little bit, having heard what I've said, do you have someone in mind that you would want to reach out for a letter of recommendation? And this one I'm going to demand on some feedback. So even if it's just a yes or no, I want to talk about it a little bit. All right, awesome. So it looks like plenty of you have already started to give it some thought. We have an idea of who we want to ask for a letter of recommendation. Without sharing too much information, does anyone want to unmute and just talk a little bit about kind of who that individual may be. And I mean, professor or supervisor, I don't necessarily want to provide names, but why that person immediately came to mind.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my experience in seeking out letters of recommendation, the recommenders, particularly at UCF. One of the ones that I went for, I was a graduate of the HUT honors thesis undergraduate thesis program, and in that I considered my thesis chair to be a recommender, and thankfully he gave me a great stellar letter of recommendation to do so. So because I did a lot of work with him in crafting the thesis, so we developed a good bond academically, and I felt like he was perhaps the strongest recommender that I could ever think of.
Yeah, and that's perfect, right? For a number of reasons. Obviously, as part of your thesis, you're going through the idea of issue spotting. What is a thesis going to be about? But we're also performing extensive research. There's a lot of writing that is involved. There's a lot of drafting that is involved. There's kind of that back and forth. And we'll get into kind of why that's important here in a little bit. But I love that response. And truthfully, I think that is in all likelihood a very strong letter of recommendation. Does anyone else have any thoughts on it or want to share their experience? All right, I won't press you guys too hard, so we'll move forward. But please keep in mind at the end, we'll open it up to questions. So if you want to circle back to anything, make a note for yourself and just ask me. Um, I would recommend, if at all possible, make the request in person. Ultimately, you're asking someone to share their opinion of you that is going to, in a lot of ways, not necessarily solely dictate, but heavily influence the likelihood of you being admitted to law school. Um, Part of the reason I say go in person is maybe it's a professor that you haven't had for a semester or a few semesters. Making sure that you're recognizable, having that personal connection is going to help jog their memory. And ultimately, we want them to be as detailed as possible in their letters of recommendation. So the more familiar they are with you, the better off. And I like the idea of this thesis supervisor because that is someone that you've worked with extensively. They're going to be familiar with you, and their opinion is going to be coming from a place of authority in the sense that they've had ample opportunity to speak about the opinions that they're providing. And we'll talk a little bit about how important that is too as we go through. So, Anthony, I see that you're an online student. And look, at the end of the day, sometimes it's just not a possibility to go do it in person, right? But what is kind of the middle ground there? Maybe it's, hey, we haven't connected in a while. Would you be open to doing a Zoom or a Teams meeting over lunch? Um, just making it as personable as possible, I think is kind of a strong way to go about it. And certainly if absolute best case scenario, the most we can do is send an email, that's fine. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about maybe what to include in that. Um, Actually, let's just get to it now. It's a bullet point down, but we can kind of go back a little bit here. If you're doing it solely in writing, which is generally going to be via email, provide context to your relationship. I took your X class in fall of 2024, 2025, whatever it may be. I really enjoyed the class. Class discussions were engaging. I really enjoyed when we spoke about Z. Give them some context, give them some anchor points to try to remember who you were as a student. Um, in terms of timing, ask as early as possible, preferably with 1 to 2 months lead time. Here at Berry Law, we do rolling admissions, so the pressure for deadlines is a little bit less, but it still exists, obviously. And many law schools will only accept applications up until a certain point. Understand this. The best letter of recommendations are likely coming from busy people, professors, supervisors, business professionals, etc. They are trying to work in a well-written, well thought out, instructive letter of recommendation amongst all their other responsibilities. And truth be told, even if you ask them on short notice, they'll usually, if they're willing to provide you a letter of recommendation at all, they'll make sure you get something in time to submit. But what you're after isn't necessarily just something. What you're after is the strongest, best letter of recommendation possible. So providing them ample lead time is a great opportunity to make sure that they have the ability to take as much time, look at things, and form. Maybe there are things in the personal statement the professor or the
Um,
supervisor wasn't aware of. Oh, yes,
Robert, sorry to bother you. I think you froze for just a second. Would you mind going back and repeating what you said?
absolutely. Do you know what the last thing I you got was?
Um, I'm not sure.
Okay, perfect. I apologize if I was out there. But I guess kind of the last point I was making was ask as early as possible. Um, a strong letter recommendation takes some time to craft, and generally speaking, the individuals that you're going to be requesting them from are busy themselves. So making sure that they have an opportunity to draft a well thought out, well reasoned letter of recommendation on your behalf is very important. And the last thing we want to do is ask them a week out and then send them an email every single day for the following 5 or 6 days, essentially making our lack of planning now their critical issue that they need to address because who knows what else they have going on. It may be professional, it may be personal, but at the end of the day, try to provide them 30 to 60 days. Generally speaking, that's going to be enough time. And with some individuals, you may find it's not. So that goes into another idea of ask maybe one or two more individuals than you anticipate actually needing. Obviously, we still want to prioritize and make sure that these individuals are speaking from an area where they've had the opportunity to observe you and speak to the opinions that they're giving authoritatively. Philip, I see huh.
I think
Was
that's
that
when
a
you froze.
okay. Perfect. Be sure to let them know how it works. Generally speaking, LSAC will send them the form and a request for a letter of recommendation. Again, generally speaking, law school applicants will not view their letters of recommendation prior to them being provided to the schools. I think they actually have you sign a waiver in that regard. So a little bit different. Again, I know in undergrad, I would have professors or prior supervisors tell me all the time, draft something up, I'll put my signature on it, you'll be good to go. Not the case here. So really want to make sure that we're focusing on individuals who know us and who have had a legitimate opportunity to kind of observe us and therefore provide opinions that aren't just what we want to hear, but opinions that we can believe in. And always ask the question, make sure that they're comfortable writing you a strong letter of recommendation. Generally speaking, if you've done well in a class, if you feel as though you were engaged, you were an active participant in group discussion, you were a group leader, whatever the case may be, it's usually going to be a yes response. But let's be honest, human relationships are complicated. And I'm sure we've all been surprised, someone we thought we were really close with or, really good friends with turns out they maybe have a slightly different opinion on the relationship. So be forthright. Just ask them. If I ask you to write me a letter of recommendation, um, do you feel comfortable providing me a strong letter of recommendation? And again, these are professionals. They'll be equally as upfront and honest with you. And again, if you identified someone as someone that you think is a good candidate to write the letter, in all likelihood, you guys are on the same page, but it never hurts to ask the question just to make sure that everyone is objectively, in fact, on that same page. So let me go forward here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about guiding the recommendation in and of itself. Because again, for the most part, you're not going to have an opportunity to review these. So when we're making the request, we want to make sure that the recommender themselves are kind of aware of the significant points they should be looking at. So the first thing you really want to do is look at your law school application as a whole and ask yourself, what are the strengths of my application? What are my weaknesses or areas where I feel as though they don't accurately represent my ability to succeed in law school. And for those of you who have applied, if you're comfortable, would you mind sharing whether or not you went through that thought process? And if so, whether or not there were specific aspects that you identified kind of in one category or the other? And if you're not comfortable with that, I completely understand. And even if you haven't applied, just thinking about, your professional history, your academics, is there a particular area where you feel as though, right, my application is really going to stand out here, but I feel as though I could really use some additional help over here? All right. So it's okay that no one's willing to share that. That one's a little bit of an awkward thing. I understand. But let's start with the most basic example. Anytime you're applying to law school, you should be looking at what their 25th percentiles are. So, what is the 25th percentile in terms of LSAT score for admitted students? What is their 25th percentile for GPA for admitted students? So, let's take Berry Law as a specific example. Currently, our 25th percentile for the LSAT is a 148. Our 25th percentile for GPA, I believe, is a 2.92. It may be a 2.91. Don't quote me too specifically on that. Let's just call it 2.9 for the sake of it. Okay. So Anthony, let's take your example for a second. Obviously, past legal experience is a potential strength, but it sounds like maybe you were doing more clerical work, whether it was data entry, calendaring, scheduling. Is that kind of the thought process there when you say you weren't substantively involved in cases? Okay. So what I love about what you just said is you say almost entirely clerical administrative. So my guess is, while it wasn't necessarily a part of your day to day, there may have been a specific project or rare occurrences where you were doing maybe some research, some drafting, some client interaction. Am I terribly far off base? Am I kind of there? Where are we at? All right, awesome. So here's the deal. At the end of the day, it may not have been a bulk of what you did, but let's say that you did want a letter of recommendation from a supervising attorney. When you're requesting it, it's important to give them that guidance, explain to them that, hey, and as an attorney, they're likely aware of this, but it doesn't hurt to mention it. The review committee isn't terribly interested in my ability to maintain a calendar, or promptly answer a phone call within 3 rings, right? If you're applying for maybe another position of a similar type, maybe that's what they're interested in. But if you were to request a letter of recommendation for them, be upfront about it. Say, hey, can you discuss the times that I did legal research or that I did drafting, or, even though I know it was only a week or a week and a half, that project I worked on. Does that make sense? Um, Also, be very upfront as to why you're asking a specific individual. Good afternoon, Professor so and so. I hope you're doing well. I know it's been a while since we spoke last. However, I've decided that I'm going to be applying to law school. I thoroughly enjoyed your class. I know I was an active participant in discussion. And I really enjoyed writing that final term paper. Would it be possible for you to draft or write me a letter of recommendation? Let them know what aspects about your interactions you're hoping that they highlight by kind of giving them that reminder. Point them in the right direction. Because otherwise, they're going to go on Google or they're going to go into ChatGPT and they're going to say, well, what makes a good law school letter of recommendation? And the 5, 6, 7 bullet points that get returned or kind of could be what they put in there generically. If there is some aspect or particular reason why you're asking somebody to write your letter of recommendation, don't just hope that they're going to touch on it. let them know that this is why I'm reaching out to you and you specifically. If at all possible, provide additional documents, whether it's your personal statement, or maybe you only took one class with a professor, but you did well academically across your entire undergraduate career. Provide them a transcript. Let them, give them the knowledge or give them the ability to put in a letter of recommendation. Not only did this particular applicant, you know, uh, perform strongly in my class, they were active participant, their written work was wonderful, and their research was thorough. But I know they were on the dean's list in blah, 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 blah time. Or, I know they graduated magna or summa cum laude, whatever the case may be. And these are things that the committee will also see because we will receive transcripts and you may mention it in your personal statement. But at the same time, it helps the reviewer seem more intimately familiar with you as an applicant, as a student. And that's important, right? I want to talk a little bit. So outside of the context, or I guess, let me ask this. Has anyone considered specific individuals to write letters of recommendation for them and kind of what are their position titles? Essentially, if you've considered asking anyone for a letter of recommendation, what is their position title? And this is kind of an obtuse way to go about this. So if we don't get it quickly, I'll move on and I'll give you what I'm really thinking about. But I just want to see if anyone touches it on themselves. All right. And truth be told, this is my first presentation like this, so I may be missing the mark a little bit. Let me just get to where I was going instead of holding you all hostage here. Um, there will be times where I will see a letter of recommendation and it is from a judge. Sounds great, right? It's you're applying to law school. This person sits on the bench. They are an attorney themselves, and not only that, as a living, they judge attorneys' arguments. What could be better? And then we start looking at the letter of recommendation, and it turns out the applicant's parents were attorneys, so they happen to know this judge for more or less their entire life, or since they were a wee lad or gal. And you're like, oh, well, the judge says I should get into law school. The law school is going to think I should get into law school. And then we go through the letter of recommendation, and it says everything we expect it to say. Glowing review. You're smart, you're intelligent, you're hardworking, you're inquisitive, professional, responsible, so on and so forth. But then we get to the heart of it, and all we can really see is that maybe you interacted with this particular judge at family barbecues or other social gatherings for 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time, maybe once or twice a year. Um, it might feel really good and it might, at first glance, read really well to have a judge saying these wonderful things about you. But the committee is going to go a little bit further than that. They're going to ask themselves, well, what is this particular individual's opportunity to observe these traits, these qualities, these opinions that they're giving? And if it's minimal, well, it's not that we inherently assume they're untrue, but it's also harder to give weight to those opinions because unfortunately, at the end of the day, I'd much rather hear from a professor who you had for an entire semester and again, talk to me about what type of student you are than a legal professional, even a judge, that you've maybe spoken to for 4 or 5 hours throughout your entire life. And again, it's not that these individuals aren't necessarily or they shouldn't have an opinion of you, but to what degree is their opinion qualified? So always keep that in mind too. I think people will often get caught up in position titles. Maybe you interned for a legislator, right? A senator's office or something. And I think the knee-jerk reaction is, well, I'm gonna ask the senator for their letter of recommendation when truth be told, maybe a lower level campaign manager is more equipped to speak about it because they worked with you on a daily basis. And we as a law school review committee, we have an understanding of, right, well, the likelihood that this person got significant face time with the senator themselves is unlikely. I'd much rather hear from someone who has had the opportunity to make legitimate observations, and therefore I feel more comfortable in relying on their opinion. Because again, I'm always asking myself, Can this person succeed in law school? Can this person succeed after law school? And when I'm weighing that decision, ultimately, the more opportunity the recommender themselves has had to observe qualities about you that answer this in the positive, the more weight I'm going to give those opinions, right? And it's again, it's not to say that I'm discounting any opinions, but certainly I am more willing to give greater weight to opinions where there is a clear expression that, hey, this individual really knows what they're saying when they talk about this applicant.
Thank you for sharing that, Robert. That's such an important point. And I think that speaks to like what the students, there's a student in the chat that was saying they were considering past professors and an employer. And I think that those are really important points to keep in mind when considering who you're going to ask the
Yeah,
recommendation.
truthfully, I think it's one of the most important. Um, And by the same token, I've had individuals whose parents are attorneys, and they go, I didn't really feel comfortable asking, not necessarily my mother or my father, right? But one of their colleagues for a letter of recommendation. But hey, I actually interned over there for 3 summers, right? My junior or my sophomore, junior, and senior summers, I interned there. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you ask? And it's, well, one of the named partners is my parent. I thought it would look like fluff. Well, no, if this person has legitimately worked with you, looked at your legal research, looked at things you've drafted, etc., just make sure that they're specific about that, right? And that goes into kind of providing them guidance about how to draft the recommendation letter. Um, if there's a reason why you think someone might discount it, just tell them to directly confront that particular reason. At the end of the day, it's what we do as attorneys, right? We confront opposing opinions, we confront suppositions, etc., with evidence that shows otherwise. So don't be afraid to guide your recommender in the same way. Um, Again, tell the recommender, hey, maybe in the introduction paragraph, talk about how we know each other, talk about the time you spent working together, explain to the reader how it is you know what you're telling me you know. And it doesn't have to be long. Priya, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Somebody also had a question about what you were saying earlier. I think they were talking about the 25% mark. When you were talking about like what to consider for schools, they were asking if you could finish what you were saying and kind of
Oh,
focusing on that.
yes. So I guess I kind of jumped into it, assuming most people were familiar with it. But as far as the 25th percentiles are concerned, so obviously it means 75% of admitted students are going to be above this number, 25% are going to be at or below that number. And that goes into kind of identifying which individuals or what types of letters of recommendation that you're going to be requesting. And I apologize because this is a very important part. I must have gotten distracted. If you look at your application and you're like, hey, my LSAT score is like in their 80th percentile, I'm killing it. But my GPA is a little bit lower than their 25th percentile. Well, what may be more important for you is academic letters of recommendation, because my guess is if you graduated, you've done well in the LSAT, and by graduated, I mean undergrad, you've done well in the LSAT, in all likelihood, you didn't do poorly in all your classes. Or at the very least, there's a handful of classes that you did very well in. So if I look at my application and I say, well, if I were on the committee, the thing that I would have the most questions about my own application would be my ability to perform well academically in a classroom setting because my GPA is lower than I would like or lower than I expected it to be. Don't hide from that. Find a professor whose class you loved, who's, in every single class, your hand was straight to the ceiling from start to finish. You did well. Ask them for a letter of recommendation, right? Because as a reviewer, I'm going to look at your transcript and I'm going to say, oh man, 2.7 GPA, not great, lower 25th percentile. I've got concerns about how they are as a student. But then I get a letter of recommendation that says this person was an active participant. They were respectful. They were professional. They were well prepared. Their final essay was well written, well researched, well thought out, and clear and concise in its message. Suddenly I'm like, all right, well, maybe they just had a bunch of prerequisite courses that they didn't do well in. Maybe it was that calculus requirement, even though they're, not really a math major, that brought them down. And I feel more comfortable in making that assumption because now I have somebody who has observed you in a classroom. and has taken the time out of their day to speak about how wonderful of a student you are, how you do have the ability to be successful as a law student. Um, with the LSAT, it's a little bit more difficult because very rarely are there individuals who can speak to your ability to take a standardized test, I guess. Um, but if you look at your resume and you're like, oh man, I suspect other individuals who've had 4 or 5 professional positions. I've really only got my last summer internship. Well, maybe focus on a supervisor from that internship, right? Try to identify the own weaknesses or what you perceive to be weaknesses in your application and look for letters of recommendation that can kind of flip it on its head. And letters of recommendation are uniquely situated in the sense that they are opinions of you, and it's really the only opportunity you get to have someone else then express an opinion about you to the committee, right? When you write your personal statement, a lot of times that is kind of your trials, your tribulations, what you've gone through, how you've been successful, what you've overcome, how you ended up where you are, and why you're pursuing the practice of law or a legal education. But it's you saying it. I would never expect you in a law school application or any application to say negative things about yourself, right? So again, it's like the recommender who hasn't really had a great opportunity to observe you, but knows the family or is, a social acquaintance for a long period of time. I expect them not to say negative things, but at the same time, it's how much credit, how much weight am I really providing those particular opinions? Um, so letters of recommendation are unique so long as you do them correctly, is that it allows for kind of more opinion related information to carry weight outside of hard numbers like an LSAT score or a GPA. So, when I say kind of identify your strengths and weaknesses, start with what those 25th percentiles are to see whether or not that's something that I need to address. Now, look, if you've scored a 175 on the LSAT and you've got a 3.9 GPA, in all likelihood, you probably don't have any real gaps or any weaknesses in your application, so to speak of. At the same time, then focus on reinforcing a strength, right? If you did perform that well academically, again, go back to the professor whose class that you did the absolute best in. Or if you've got a really strong professional resume, think about the environment where you had the most opportunity to take responsibility, to be a leader, and maybe request it from that person. Because in the same way that a letter of recommendation can kind of assist in bolstering a weakness, it can also help to solidify a strength in and of itself. Some other things to just kind of keep in mind when you are requesting the letter of recommendation. Let the recommender know what's important, right? And just from a law school perspective, your problem solving ability, critical reading and analysis, your research and writing abilities, organization and time management skills. Do you have a dedication of public service, or have you expressed a dedication to the pursuit of justice in and of itself? How do you collaborate in a group setting? And do you have any prior knowledge or exposure to the law? And look, none of these things are dispositive or required, but think about, ultimately what qualities you would need to be successful as a law student, and ask the individuals drafting your letters of recommendation, um, sorry about that, to speak to those specifically. Also let them know comparisons are helpful. Maybe you are in the top 3% or 5% of students or interns that this person has ever taught or supervised. Have them provide that, right? Law school is competitive in nature. And if there is a long tenured professor or someone who has been in a professional position for an extended period of time, and they're willing to say, hey, in all my years, this person is like top 5, top 3, best, whatever the case may be, that again goes a long way. The other aspect too is most of you who apply to law school will be applying to multiple law schools. Try to ask your recommender to avoid mentioning any specific law schools, if at all possible. Now, in some cases, maybe it's an alumnus or something where you're like, nope, I'm only sending this letter of recommendation to this one law school. My other ones are more generic, right? So there may be a specific reason why you want them to, specifically mention a law school. When so-and-so came to speak to me about applying to Barry University School of Law as a Barry alumnus, I was thrilled. That's okay, but maybe you don't use that one for another law school, or maybe you ask them to send 2 versions. At the end of the day, I think for most review committee members, it's not going to be a big deal because oftentimes that's sort of an oversight on the recommenders part. Again, you're not viewing these. So a lot of times, maybe it came up in conversation, hey, this law school is my number one. That's stuck in their brain. And when they're drafting your letter, it just happens to work its way in there. Generally speaking, we're not going to hold it against you. I know when I review applications, I rarely, if ever, do. I mean, I guess maybe if all letters of recommendation are the same way, but if it's one or two out of the three, I just assume that it was probably a comment made during conversation that got picked up by the recommender themselves, and it's not necessarily because this person requested that they do that. In other words, I don't impart a lack of attention to detail or anything to the applicant themselves. I just assume it's some kind of miscommunication. But if we can avoid having to require anyone to make these assumptions or kind of look further into it or ask themselves about it, always a plus. That's really kind of the long and the short of it. I'll be honest with you, I'm surprised I covered 52 minutes. I hope I left enough time for questions at the end. My name, my direct line, my email address, as well as our website is up there if anyone would like it. Um, please ask questions now outside of that. If you're still in the process, you've liked what I've had to say, and you're just not ready with the questions yet, please feel free to reach out to me, telephone, email, whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, I want to see the best for our profession. And by that, I mean the legal profession. And that starts with making sure that the best people are being admitted to law school. So if you feel as though you fall into that group, you're looking to do some good out there and you just need some advice or guidance, please understand that I am absolutely a resource here for you. So before I sign off, assuming Priya, we have enough time, I do want to open the floor to questions.
Yes.
And I'll say this. Ideally, we'll focus on letters of recommendation because I know you guys are going to have multiple presentations about other aspects of applying to law school. But certainly, if you have any questions about law school in general or other aspects of the application process, please feel free to ask me. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Like I said, my goal is to make sure that when you're submitting your application, it is in the best state it possibly can be.
So we have a question from Philip. Who would be a good recommendation outside of a legal or academic background that could be considered as well based on skills? He was just curious about it.
Yeah, so Philip, let's talk about that a little bit. I'll give you an example that's relatively easy. Obviously, if there's some individuals you have in mind, if you want to float them out there, I can speak to them specifically. But let's say there is a local organization, whether it is a faith-based organization that does charity work, maybe it's an animal shelter, maybe it's a soup kitchen that isn't attached to a faith-based organization, right? Dedication to service, willingness to help the local community. These are all also aspects that, weigh heavily in terms of someone being prepared to do well in law school and thereafter. Ultimately, what we do as attorneys is very stressful. If you don't have a passion for what you do, if you don't find fulfillment or reward in helping others, it can be a very taxing profession. And that's not to say that it won't be, even if you possess those qualities, but it is certainly far more bearable if those qualities are something that you possess. So in the same line, anything that it shows your willingness to go above and beyond to help is wonderful. And certainly if you've been with the organization or volunteering long enough that maybe you've taken over some supervisory or planning capacity, someone who can speak to those aspects of it will start to bleed back into sort of that professionalism, right? Prompt professional communication, time management skills, working with clients, maybe they're outside vendors, etc. So that's just one example.
Thank you. We also had another question. So what would your advice be for those who seek to apply after they've earned their bachelor's degree and now they're outside the university environment? Would it just be employers or what are your thoughts?
So Anthony, it really depends. And again, right, it'll go back to kind of what strengths and weaknesses you've identified in your own application. Here's the deal. If you graduated undergrad and it's been a decade and you graduated with a 4.0, it's probably okay to forego it. A decade is long enough that, again, when I start to question, what level of authority is the recommender speaking with, I can say, all right, well, this person is probably a very different person than they were 10 years ago, especially if they haven't had a continued relationship. Also, they graduated with a 4.0. I don't really have any questions about their ability to succeed in an academic setting. They've clearly demonstrated that ability for 3 to 4 years. Alternatively, if your GPA is maybe a little bit lower, even let's say like a 3.2, right? So still above the 25th percentile, and it's only been a year, maybe a year and a half since you've been in the school. Um, I would still go back and try to remake that connection. Um, so it kind of all exists on a scale, and it really comes down to your specific circumstances. And there are certainly times where 2 to 3 professional letters of recommendation are going to be exactly what you need. That being said, unless we're starting to get into that kind of extreme, a decade has passed, I did really well kind of thing, still make the effort, right? I always give the advice, a closed mouth doesn't get fed. You may think that a professor doesn't recommend or doesn't remember you because of the passage of time or because it's a first year seminar course and every class has 180 students in it. You would be very surprised, especially if you were an active participant, and you performed well. I'm sure some of you have sat in classes of 100 plus people, especially being at a larger school, right? And been like, man, it's like the same 4 or 5 people that speak every single class. Some people love those people. They're like, oh, they took the heat off of me. Other people are like, ah, look at that person trying to show off, right? And it doesn't really matter how you feel about them. But understand that, if you've ever been one of those people, even in a larger class and with the passage of time, it's a very good chance the professor has a much better recollection of you than you're expecting.
Thank you so much, Robert. We really appreciate all of the advice that you've given in this session, and thank you for making it such an engaging and interesting session. Students, if you have any further questions for Robert, he dropped his email and I put it in the chat as well. And you're also free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for being here, Robert. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. It was wonderful presenting to you all. These are discussions I love happening. And I know that I'll likely be out, I think, just under a month's time. I think March 3rd, we're going to be doing some tabling there. So hopefully you guys will be getting advertisements about that and things like that. So if you want to come pick my brain more or speak to a student ambassador who we'll likely have with us or one of my co-directors or managers, we'll all be there and we're more than happy to sit down and have a discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Take care, everyone.